Welcome to the debate. I'm your host.
And I'm the dissenter.
So, today we are wrestling with a tension that really sits at the very foundation of religious architecture. And when I say architecture, I'm not talking about, flying buttresses or stained glass. I'm talking about the architecture of belief itself. How do we structure a relationship with the divine? Is the spiritual life best constructed through specific, authoritative ordinances like baptism, directed toward a transcendent God above? Or is that structure, well, maybe too rigid, perhaps even archaic? Should we instead be looking for a radical shift in perspective, recognizing the divine within us?
It's really the difference between building a fortress to keep the chaos out and, well, learning to swim in the ocean. And we're drawing today from two very different texts. One is a philosophical exploration called Divine Dimensions, which deals with the psychology of perspective, this cosmic perspective, and the nature of fear. The other is a theological deep dive, the Covenant of Baptism, which focuses specifically on Latter-day Saint doctrines and how they contrast with broader Christian and historical traditions.
And I'll be representing the position that specific forms, covenants, and the recognition of a transcendent God are necessary. We need authority, we need a concrete path for salvation. And as we'll see when we look at the crisis of modern community, we need a defined structure to hold us all together.
And I'm here to argue that spiritual maturity isn't about checking some doctrinal box or submitting to a hierarchy. It comes from changing one's perspective and internalizing the divine. Meaning comes from action and courage, not from historical rigidity or specific rituals.
Okay, so let's start with the psychology of this. The core of my argument begins with human nature, as it's described in Divine Dimensions. The text describes the earth-bound perspective. So imagine standing at the foot of a massive mountain or a cathedral. You look up, you feel small, you feel dependent.
Which usually triggers insecurity, right?
And this is my point, it triggers safety. The text argues that this looking up is not a bug in our operating system, it's a feature. We instinctively look up for the divine because we need to feel small to feel safe. We need to know there's something bigger than us, something capable of managing the chaos we can't control. If God is just my own inner voice, then God is just as confused as I am. We need the God above to establish order.
But that looking up creates such an immense psychological distance. It creates a gap between humanity and the divine that you then have to spend your whole life trying to bridge. My argument, supported by this cosmic perspective in the source material, is that looking up is just an incomplete picture.
Incomplete how?
Well, the text asks us to imagine the view from space. When astronauts look back at Earth, they call it the overview effect. They don't see borders. They don't see hierarchies. They see a single fragile organism. Humanity becomes a single family. And in this view, the divine isn't up there, separate from us. It's immanent. It is the God within. When you shift to this perspective, you don't feel small in a submissive way. You feel connected. You realize that you are the divine in action.
That is a beautiful image. And look, I don't deny the aesthetic power of it, but beauty isn't necessarily utility. If God is just within, where is the moral authority? This is why I believe the vertical relationship, the God above, requires specific mechanisms to bridge that gap. You can't just think your way across the chasm between a finite human and an infinite God. And this is where the text, the Covenant of Baptism, becomes crucial.
So you're moving from psychology to theology now?
Because the theology answers the psychological need. The text argues that baptism isn't just a symbol, it's a gate. It's a necessary new beginning. The text is explicit. We must be born of water and of the Spirit. It's an act of obedience that signifies we are submitting to something higher than our own intuition. It's the external validation that the internal self craves.
But I have to push back on the idea that the mechanism is the main point. The truth of the experience isn't in the water or the authority holding your arm, it's in the psychological shift. The source material offers a formula that I find much more compelling than a ritual requirement. It says, belief plus action plus courage equals purpose.
A formula is fine, but it's abstract.
It's practical. If you have those three things, if you can replace fear with faith, you've achieved the spiritual goal. Whether you are submerged in water or not seems
Well, secondary to whether you can live without fear. If I have the courage to act with purpose, why do I need the water?
Because belief and action need a container. The covenant of baptism text doesn't just talk about personal salvation or feeling good. It lists specific obligations to bear one another's burdens, to mourn with those that mourn, to stand as a witness of God. These are binding agreements. You can have all the cosmic perspective you want, but without a covenant obligation to your neighbor, that perspective can become very self-centered. The ritual creates the community.
Community exists because of shared values, not just shared rituals. But let's dig deeper into this distinction you're making about the nature of God, because that dictates everything else. You're holding fast to this idea of transcendence, the Western view.
Absolutely. And the text backs this up. It highlights the view of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. God is creator, king, father. He is separate and holy. This separation creates a dynamic of reverence plus relationship. If God is not separate from us, we're essentially worshiping ourselves. We need that separation to understand our own limitations. Without the God above, God becomes too impersonal, too abstract to help us when we're suffering. A cosmic force doesn't care if you lose your job. A father does.
But that Father also judges you. The Eastern and indigenous views highlighted in the text, God in nature, or the Atman and Buddha nature, create unity plus awakening. If we see God as only outside, only above, it limits our ability to act with courage. Why? Because we're constantly waiting for external help. We become passive. We look up and wait for lightning to strike. But if we accept the God within, we realize we have the strength to act right now. We gain agency.
I think you're creating a false dichotomy there. The source material, and this is a critical synthesis, concludes that God must be both, outside to be the source, and inside to be closer than breath. My point is that the outside aspect is the one that demands the ritual. You cannot ignore the king just because you feel the spirit.
Fair enough on the synthesis. But let's look at how that king has supposedly operated throughout history. This brings us to the specific necessity of baptism. You're arguing it's an eternal requirement, a universal law.
It is. The text is clear. Jesus Christ, who was sinless, was baptized to fulfill all righteousness. If the Son of God required this ordinance to demonstrate obedience, how can any of us claim to be exempt? It sets a pattern of humility and submission to the Father that applies to everyone.
That works for the New Testament context. But this is where the text gets fascinatingly messy and where your argument for eternal consistency hits a historical wall. What about the ancients? The academic and traditional Christian view is very clear. Baptism is a New Testament innovation.
Innovation or restoration.
Innovation. Abraham, Moses, David, they were not baptized. The Jews had the mikvah, which was a ritual bath for cleansing impurity, but it wasn't the Christian initiation of baptism for the remission of sins. They were saved by faith, or by adherence to the law. If baptism is the absolute gate, then Abraham is standing outside of it.
That's the traditional Christian dilemma, yes. But I would frame it differently, using the Latter-day Saint perspective provided in our source. The covenant of baptism text references the Pearl of Great Price, specifically the Book of Moses, and it makes a bold claim that resolves this tension, that Adam and Enoch were baptized.
Which is a massive theological retcon. You realize that, right?
It's an argument for the continuity of revelation. The idea is that the rules of salvation don't change just because time passes or cultures shift. If baptism is the gate, it must have been the gate for Adam just as it is for us. The text argues that the gospel was preached from the beginning. It frames God as consistent rather than changing the requirements for salvation halfway through human history.
But that requires you to essentially rewrite history, or at least accept a version of history that has no archaeological or textual backing outside of that specific tradition, and look at the edge cases mentioned in the text. Take King David.
King David is certainly a complex figure in this theology.
Complex is putting it mildly. The source notes that David's spiritual status is debated because of his sins involving Uriah. but traditional Christianity says he wasn't baptized simply because the ordinance didn't exist yet. The dissenter in me has to ask, is this retrofitting of history necessary? If the spiritual intent, the faith of Abraham, the heart of David is what matters, why do we need to insist they went under the water? It feels like we're prioritizing the bureaucracy of salvation over the substance of it.
It's not bureaucracy, it's order. It's the God above providing a consistent path. If the path changes every few centuries, can we trust it? Regarding David, the text implies that his fallen state is due to breaking covenants, which implies he had covenants to break. It reinforces the weight of the ordinance. It's not just a splash of water, it's a high-stakes agreement. When you enter that gate, the stakes for your moral choices go up.
High stakes, sure. But let's pivot to what those stakes actually mean in a modern context. We're not just talking about ancient history here. The Divine Dimensions text moves us toward the topic of fear versus faith. It argues that the ultimate goal of spirituality is the command, do not fear.
I agree with the goal. The question is how we get there.
Right. But look around us. We have a modern society suffering from a crisis of meaning. The source material brings up a very stark statistic regarding birth rates and community formation. People are lonely. They aren't having children. The text suggests this is because of a lack of community rituals.
Exactly.
But wait, my argument is that we can solve this with the cosmic perspective and community values. We don't need the theological baggage of debating whether Moses swam in a river. We need the action component. Meaning is created when belief plus action plus courage equals purpose. You can achieve a modern baptism through a secular commitment to your community. A secular naming ceremony, a pledge to a cause. These can replace the ritual function.
I have to push back hard on that. That is the just as good argument, and the data doesn't support it. A secular naming ceremony or a general promise to be a good neighbor completely lacks the binding weight of a covenant with God. The source material highlights the baptismal covenant specifically. Bear one another's burdens, mourn with those that mourn.
We can do that without the water. We can mourn with people because we have empathy, not because we have a contract.
Can we? Effectively, consistently. The religious ritual creates the village that makes raising children possible. The text asks, is there a solution to help increase birth rates similar to baptism? The answer lies in the structure. When you are baptized into a faith community, you aren't just joining a club. You are entering a web of mutual obligation that is enforced by your belief in the God above. A secular community relies on feelings. If I don't feel like helping you move your couch, I won't. But if I have covenanted with God to bear your burden, I show up. That structure provides the security people need to bring children into the world.
That's a strong point about the binding nature of the covenant versus the fluidity of feelings. I'll concede that secular commitments often lack teeth. However, the text also says, meaning is not created by belief alone. Meaning comes from action that aligns with your deepest values. If the rigid structure of the God above creates fear, fear of punishment, fear of doing it wrong, fear of a God who demands paperwork, then it counteracts the courage we need. You're trading loneliness for anxiety.
But the structure isn't meant to create fear. It's meant to alleviate it. That's the paradox.
Explain that. Because to many, a God who demands specific rituals sounds terrifyingly exacting.
By submitting to the ordinance, by entering the gate, you receive the promise of the remission of sins. The text calls it a new beginning. That is the ultimate antidote to fear. You aren't carrying the weight of your past anymore. The God above has taken it from you. That allows you to act with the courage you're talking about. You know the rules, you followed the path, and now you are free to run.
I come at it from a different way. I think the courage comes from realizing the God within. The text says, if God is within you, you gain strength. You act with courage because the divine is already in your heart. You don't need the external permission slip. You need the internal awakening. The text mentions the mantra, pray, follow God, do not fear, act. That sequence doesn't mention get baptized. It focuses on the direct connection between the individual and the divine.
Follow God is the second step in that mantra.
And if God says, be baptized, then following him necessitates the ritual. You can't separate the obedience from the relationship.
Unless following God means following the divine conscience within rather than an external set of rules. The text mentions that different religions imagine God's location differently. If you're a mystic or follow an Eastern tradition, following God might mean sitting in silence and dissolving your ego, not marching into a font. The cosmic perspective allows for that variety. It says, truth is found in the expansion of the heart, not the narrowing of the rules.
But expansion without direction is just chaos. The earthbound perspective described in the text, looking up, feeling small, is what gives us direction. It creates humility. And in a world that is increasingly narcissistic, where everyone wants to be their own God, looking up is a radical and necessary act. It reminds us that we are not the center of the universe.
And I would argue that looking down from space, the cosmic perspective, does the exact same thing, but in a healthier way. You see the Earth as fragile. You see humanity as one. You feel awe, responsibility, and connection. You don't feel small in a shameful way. You feel small in a connected way. It produces unity plus awakening rather than reverence plus relationship.
There is certainly value in that awe, but let's look at the practical application the text brings up regarding meaning. You mentioned the formula: belief plus action plus courage equals purpose.
Yes, it's the engine of a meaningful life.
I would argue that belief requires content. You can't just believe, you have to believe in something. The covenant of baptism provides that content. It tells you what to believe and how to act. It structures the action. Without the ordinance, the action is left to our own whims. With the ordinance, the action is stand as a witness of God at all times. It's a distinct, difficult, and transformative charge.
It is distinct, but is it exclusive? That's where I get stuck. The text asks if God is outside or inside the universe. And the deepest thinkers, the mystics, the philosophers referenced in Divine Dimensions say both. If God is both, then surely the path to God can be both. It can be the rigorous, covenanted path you defend, but it must also be the path of the God within, accessible to the person who has never heard of baptism, but lives with profound courage and love. If we lock God behind a gate, we make him too small.
And if we remove the gate entirely, we might find that there's no wall left to lean on when the storm comes. We need the structure to protect us from our own fallibility. We are experts at deceiving ourselves. The ordinance is an objective anchor.
That's a compelling argument. We are certainly fallible and our internal compass can spin. But I worry that the anchor can become a chain.
It's a tension that perhaps cannot be fully resolved, only balanced. To summarize my position, while I appreciate the beauty of the cosmic perspective, I believe the source material makes a powerful case for the God above and the specific covenants that bind us to him. We need the structure. We need the baptismal covenant to give us a true new beginning and the remission of sins. It provides the objective reality of salvation that our subjective feelings can't always sustain. It connects us to a community through binding obligation, which is the only way to truly solve the crisis of isolation.
And to summarize my view, while I acknowledge the social utility of rituals, the deepest spiritual truth found in these texts is the shift in mindset. Seeing the God within gives us the strength to live that powerful mantra: pray, follow God, do not fear, act. If we focus too much on the external God above, we risk paralysis or exclusion. But if we recognize the divine is closer than our own breath, we find the courage to live with purpose, regardless of which rituals we have or haven't performed.
The goal, as our sources agree, is to move from fear to purpose. We invite you, the listener, to consider where you find your strength. Are you looking up for help?
Or are you looking within for strength?
Thanks for listening to The Debate.